All right. Well, this evening we're going to pick up in verse 41, 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 41, which you'll recall we left off on Wednesday. David had headed down into the ravine, picked himself up 5 river rocks, and was getting ready to cross the dry riverbed, more than likely. They call them wadis. They fill up during the rainy season, but I would venture to say at this particular time it was probably dry, which is what facilitated David being able to pick out some good rocks and then to cross over that. Well, when Goliath saw him coming, and it begins in verse 41, it says, "Then the Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him." Now, it's interesting to me that a man that's 9.5 feet tall, that he needs a shield bearer to go in front of him, especially when David was probably about half his height.
No armor.
What's that?
With no armor or anything.
Yeah, no armor, no nothing. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. In other words, probably to Goliath, just some sunburned kid coming at him with no armor and nothing but a sling in his hand. And I'm sure Goliath took one look at him and thought, what in the world are these idiots doing?
Probably just laughed.
Yeah, well, I think he did. Between that and cussing him out. He said, and the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" Now, you'll recall that in addition to the sling, David did have a shepherd's crook with him that he would use to, navigate across rocky areas and probably to poke the sheep to get them to go in the right direction. Well, he's got his shepherd's crook with him, so that's what he's talking about when Goliath looks at him and said, "You coming at me with a stick?" Said, and the Philistine cursed David by his gods. That probably was not a smart thing to do on Goliath's part. The Philistine also said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted." Now notice again, David never sways from this identification of Israel with being the armies, not of Israel, but the armies of the living God. And that is the difference between David and Saul. David consistently views all of Goliath's taunts, his cursings and what have you, as an insult, not to Saul, not to the army, but to God. Said, then, "This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." Now, one thing which tells us about David's understanding of God, clearly David has faith in God. He trusts that God's going to deal with this situation. He trusts that God's going to protect him. But notice that even at this point in Israelite history, what do you see of David's understanding of the nature of God when he says that everybody's going to know that there is a God in Israel?
That gods are regional.
He's still thinking regionally. And you would think that David, of all people, by this point, would have developed the personal theology to understand that God is God everywhere. But he's probably heard this so many times and been indoctrinated into him by priests, Levites, and what have you. They still have this idea that their God is a regional God of Israel.
They thought that forever.
What's that?
They've always thought that, though. They still do.
Yeah. All right, verse 7 said, there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So, David does realize he's not out there alone. Not only is God going to be the one that's going to deal with this, but he says, you're not going to be delivered into my hands, like all of you will be delivered into our hands. So David recognizes that he is in fact out there, not only as God's representative, but he is now representing his whole nation. Then it happened, when the Philistine rose and came and drew near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. Now the fact that he's already crossed the wadi, gotten his ammunition, and now he's running toward the battle line, this kind of tells us that the Philistines were expecting the Jews to come and meet them in battle, rather than them taking the battle to the Israelites. Now, why would they be expecting them to do that? Why was the so-called battle line on the Philistine side of the creek? Come on, folks, think tactically, militarily speaking.
That would put the Philistine forces closer to the battle line.
The Philistines were they were a little more savvy on the military tactics at this point than the Israelites were, and knew that if we can get them to come to us, we're the ones with the advantage. Because not only, remember, they're both on a mountain on either side. And if they can get the Israelites to approach where they are, they can fight downhill. And anybody that knows anything at all about just battle tactics, if you're fighting uphill, you're fighting a losing battle. The Philistines wanted to get them closer where the Philistines that were up on the hilltop, or at least on the hill, shooting arrows down across the heads of their own soldiers, right into the middle of the Israelite lines. Philistines were no idiots. They knew how to fight a war, which is interesting because Israel had, from its very beginning, all the way back to the time of Abraham, apparently been a nation of professional soldiers. But somewhere in the process, they had forgotten just what would be considered basic battle tactics. They'd gone long enough in subjection to the Philistines and other nations around them, they'd forgotten how to fight. Now, on the other hand, God may have allowed that to happen, because if you don't know how to do something, what does that naturally force you to do? Look at it from a Christian perspective.
Turn to God for help.
That's exactly what God probably was trying to get them to do. God was allowing this to happen, that they would stop depending upon their own military prowess, and like David, realize that God would fight the battle for them. All they had to do was show up and be obedient. And that's the thing David understood that Saul didn't. All right, verse 49 says, and David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Now keep in mind, Goliath is wearing armor, which would have included a metal helmet. If he hit Goliath hard enough with that river rock that it sunk in, that rock was traveling. And it probably weighed about 2 or 3 pounds. And when David probably got his sling going, he might have let it loose better than 100 miles an hour. And if it sunk into Goliath's forehead, Goliath never knew what hit him. He probably was dead before his body hit the ground.
See, I thought this was a battle between the two champions, that the army were standing back.
Well, that's what the Philistines are trying to sucker the Israelites into to begin with.
Okay, so it was really just them trying to pull them into it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, again, keep in mind that the Philistines had tried this practice before, where you send your champion out, we'll send our champion out, and the winner of that will just call the whole thing off, and whichever one of you loses, you get to be our slaves. The Philistines were expecting that with Goliath as their champion, plus, remember, Goliath's 4 giant sons are behind him with the rest of the Philistine army. They figured there's no way we're going to lose this. But then when they did lose it, instead of putting their weapons down and saying, well, hey, that's the deal, we lost, we're now your slaves, they reneged real fast. As we'll see, that what happens immediately after this, they turn and start running.
I find it interesting that those 4 giant brothers of Goliath turned and ran. They didn't react in rage that their brother was killed and seek revenge on that battlefield.
It wasn't
The son.
It wasn't his brother. It was his 4
His
sons.
sons, okay.
Yeah.
4 sons.
So
They were
basically,
looking to avenge their father that day. They turned and ran.
yep. Because you remember when we looked up 2 Samuel, now I forget the verse, or chapter 19, I think. At the end of that chapter, it tells us that the other 4 were sons of Goliath.
And were killed later.
Uh-huh.
They weren't killed this day.
Yeah, not that day. They got killed later.
Which means they turned and ran.
Uh-huh. But also, if they were tall as well, 7, 8, 9 feet tall, if they're running, guess what? They got a stride. They probably outran everybody else, which is how they survived that day. Because Israelites, they had a very limited number of horses, and the only ones they had was what they had previously captured from the Philistines. And in fact, the Bible, or the law of Moses, forbid them to have a large, menagerie of horses. They were limited as to how many they could have. And, and again, the reason for that, God wanted them to depend on Him and not on their military capabilities. The Philistines, on the other hand, have got horses and chariots, so the Philistine cavalry probably pulled their horses around and took off running. The 4 sons of Goliath would have been physically able to outrun everybody else. So guess who gets caught?
The foot soldiers.
The foot soldiers, who were slower. Kind of like the old joke that, if you encounter a bear in the woods, you don't have to outrun the bear. You just got to outrun the guy in front, the slowest guy in the crowd. All right. Verse 50 says, thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in David's hand. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him, cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now, imagine this as well. How big was Goliath's sword?
pretty big, but
Yeah,
sure he
you
was
remember
running
you're
on.
talking a sword that's been probably specially made for a 9-foot tall man, and David's a little runt of, we don't know for sure, but 5 foot something.
I think he had some adrenaline on his side.
And he probably had to depend on some of that adrenaline to be able to pick this sword up and cut Goliath's head off with it.
The way they depicted it in the house of David was that he was barely able to lift it and swing it. It's so big.
But I think Connie's right. You figured he probably had some adrenaline pumping. And probably he more than likely also had some supernatural help.
Yeah.
And the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the slain Philistines lay along the way to Sheraim, even to Gath and Ekron. In other words, they not only crossed the Wadi, chased the Philistines,
All the way home.
but continued chasing them all the way home, which was a distance of about another 15 miles. And the sons of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines and plundered their camps. Well, where would their camps have been?
The other side of the mountain.
Yeah, they're on their side of the mountain, which they probably just abandoned all of their supplies, their camps, left all of their equipment that they didn't personally have on them, left them there. So this would have been a major plunder for the Israelites. Then David took the Philistines. I thought this was always a little gruesome. Then David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent.
They had a habit back in those days of sticking heads on pikes.
Yeah, now, but here's the issue. Why Jerusalem?
Show what had happened.
Jerusalem
Remember-
isn't the capital yet.
Capital A.
At this point, Jerusalem's not even in Israelite hands yet. The Israelites at this time in history were allowed access to the city of Jerusalem. They could come and go. They were allowed to come and, basically the merchants were allowed to bring their wares and what have you.
But the city still belonged to the
The
Jebusites.
city still belonged to the Jebusites. The Israelites had not been able to defeat the Jebusites at this point, and they hadn't even really tried to because the Jebusites outgunned them, so to speak. So, why does David take Goliath's head to Jerusalem? Stands outside the gate and says, "Hey, Jebusites,
You're next.
look at what I got. You're next." That's exactly what he was doing. Because you think the Jebusites knew who Goliath was?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Goliath probably had a reputation throughout the entire region. A 9-foot, 6-foot, or a 9-foot, 6-inch tall man
Bully.
who's a bully and the Philistine champion, you better believe they knew who he was. And so when David shows up with a man's head wearing a Philistine helmet, of course, he may possibly have taken the helmet off. Otherwise, you got to think, how did he pick the head up? So it's possible he may have taken that off. But what would have been very prominent, other than the fact that it was a decapitated head?
It would have been large.
Well, not only large, but he'd have been
Dimple.
he'd have had a big, large hole right here.
Yeah.
So David would have gone to Jerusalem and basically taunted the Jebusites and let them know that you better be scared because we're coming after you next. And in fact, we know that once David began to amass an army of his own, guess who one of his first conquests was? Jerusalem. All right. Now, let's see.
55.
Huh?
55.
Yeah. Said he brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his weapons in his tent. Well, that tells us that when David had gone there to begin with, and he took some supplies with him, he had a tent with him. He clearly was planning on being there for a while. Now, when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, now, by the way, this is one of the reasons that there's a good chance that the events of chapter 17 happen before chapter 16. So when David saw Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this young man? And Abner said, by your life, O king, I do not know. Well, now, if David had been Saul's personal musician, you think Saul would have known who David was?
And who he was the son of.
And who he was. Absolutely, he would have. And also, as Bruce mentioned last week, when David was recommended to Saul, he was described as a mighty warrior. If the events of chapter 16 occurred first, David had never been in battle in his life other than against a lion and a bear. He wouldn't have been described as a mighty warrior.
That nobody other except his family even knew about.
Yeah, nobody would have even known about him. So this tells me all of these events occur before Saul decides, you know what, go get that guy David and bring him in here and let him play for me. And verse 56, and the king said, you inquire whose son the youth is. So when David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the Philistine's head in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I'm the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite. Now again, Saul would have known this. Abner would have known this if this had occurred in chronological order as it's given to us in the Bible. So clearly this is one of those instances when we can see that the Bible clearly was written not chronologically, but according to what Samuel, for whatever reason, felt was more important and needed to be told first. Now, and I'll finish with this before we finish our service out tonight. If Samuel was writing all of this history topically, and when they did that, they would always put the things up front that they felt to be more important. That's the case. And chapter 16 tells us about Saul's evil spirit that's tormenting him, and the fact that the Spirit of God departed from Saul. And chapter 17 is just a war story that tells us about how David became famous. Guess what Samuel considered to be the more important story? The spiritual one, not the military one. Saul being rejected by God and God sending a spirit to torment him was a way more important story to Samuel than David killing Goliath. Questions this evening?
Yesterday in Michael Heiser's book, The Unseen Realm, he mentioned that there's apparently a discrepancy between what's in our Bibles and what was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls about Goliath's height. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, his height is mentioned as 4 cubits and a span, not 6 cubits and a span, which would make him only 6 feet 6 inches tall. And he goes on to point out that skeletal remains from that era show that the height of the average Jew at that time, male Jew, was only 5 feet to 5 feet 6 inches. And that a man 6 feet 6 inches would have been considered a giant.
Which is what Saul was. That would have been an accurate description of Saul's height, but not Goliath. There's also
Dead Sea Scrolls only put Goliath's height at 4 cubits and a span instead of 6 cubits and a span.
But the question is, which one is authoritative?
I don't know. Are the Dead Sea Scrolls not scripture?
Depends on which one you found. Keep in mind that when they found the scrolls there in the Dead Sea, not everything that was found there was part of Scripture. There were other documents there. I'd go back and find out which document was that information found in. Was it a scriptural document or was it one of the other historical documents? And let's face it, if he was only 6'6", that's not a giant.
But the people who are only 5 feet tall, it would be.
But not to the rest of the world. And the Philistines themselves were taller than the Israelites. but yet they clearly considered Goliath a giant.
That means you consider William a giant now.
No, just
You gotta
wondering
just
if our
give you
whole
perspective,
concept
though.
of giants is off base.
I'll go with what I found in the Bible.
Yeah.
You chase after the other stuff if you want to. I'm sticking with what I've got in here.
You need to have skeletal remains of bigger people, so.
And you also got to keep in mind that's not the only skeletal remains that have been found in Canaan. There's been some that were a whole lot bigger than that.
I met Hulk Hogan, I met some of these basketball players. You're looking up like this when you're shaking your hand. They're giants to me.
Sure.
Mhm.